Hey, today I pulled together 7 cases where these hard-headed women were attacked by bears. From a Montana trailhead where a ranger posted specific, confirmed warnings about a grizzly sighted repeatedly during the preceding week, to a restricted backcountry corridor in northwestern Wyoming where closure signs had been placed at every access point, but one woman walked past all of it. But first, let's go back to May of 2020 and the story of Sharon Smith being attacked by a bear. It was May 18th, 2020, and the Northern Rockies were in the particular transition that defines Montana in mid-spring, the lower trails accessible again after the snowmelt had pulled back from the valley floors, the soil wet and soft underfoot from weeks of accumulated runoff, the brush already thick with new growth pressing close to the trail edges. The terrain gave the impression of manageable wilderness, the kind of landscape that registers as approachable until the specific conditions inside it reveal themselves at close range. Sharon Smith was 49 years old. She worked in real estate and had built a personal reputation for treating a committed plan as something that existed outside the jurisdiction of inconvenient new information. A trip was a trip once it had been decided. That quality had served her well in professional environments where the cost of being wrong was recoverable. This was not one of those environments. The trait that makes someone good at closing deals is, in a very specific way, the trait that can get someone killed on a trail. Certainty is an asset until it isn't. She had arrived at the trailhead that morning as part of a plan she had already organized and was simply executing. Rangers had posted written notices and were communicating warnings verbally to arriving hikers. A grizzly bear had been sighted in the area multiple times during the previous week. This was not a general seasonal advisory. It was a targeted warning about a specific animal with a documented pattern of movement in a specific trail corridor during a specific and recent window. Sharon received the warning directly. She assessed it and continued onto the trail alone. Listen, she already received a warning. Clear signs and a verbal caution about this recent sighting, but she simply ignored it. Just why would you do something so idiotic? That decision made in the parking lot, not on the trail, is the actual origin point of what followed. The bear did not make a decision that morning. Sharon did. The trail moved through open terrain before narrowing between 2 ridge lines, the brush rising above head height and the path winding through it rather than offering clear sight lines ahead. In dense spring brush in the Northern Rockies, a 500-pound animal can be functionally invisible at 25 feet. The fact that you cannot see such a huge animal because of such conditions is unbelievable. Like, why even try to go when you can't even see anything? Humans are not built to face such animals and situations, so again, just why? Grizzly bears emerge from their dens between late March and early May, covering substantial ground along the same drainage corridors and lower elevation brush that hikers use. An average adult male weighs between 400 and 600 pounds and is capable of running at up to 35 miles per hour. In a close-range surprise encounter, the response is not predatory, it is defensive. The reflex is immediate and explosive. Sharon rounded a bend and encountered the grizzly at a distance. Investigators later estimated at fewer than 20 feet. She turned to retreat. The rapid reversal of direction produced the same stimulus signature that fleeing prey produces. At 20 feet, the available distance was not a margin. By the time her body registered what was happening and began to respond, the response was already irrelevant. The bear closed the distance and made contact from behind. The first strike is delivered through the forepaw, sufficient to fracture the skull or drive a standing person directly to the ground. Sharon went down. From the ground, the bear had complete mechanical advantage, its weight applied over her upper body, the claws raking across the neck and scalp, the bite applied to the back of the head and cervical spine. The attack was concentrated and severe, over in seconds. Sharon Smith died on a trail she had been warned not to enter, by people standing at the entrance specifically to warn her. The warning was not vague. It was not general. It was about that trail, that week, that animal. She heard it and walked past it anyway. The next case involves a woman who had far more warning than a posted sign. She watched the bear issue warnings for several minutes. She heard people around her asking her to stop more than once. She continued anyway. It was July 7th, 2016, and eastern Tennessee's mountain trails were pulling the summer crowds. The trail Linda Mercer was walking with her family bent approximately a mile in and opened onto a partial meadow where the vegetation thinned at the forest edge. Linda Mercer was 54 years old. She had been hiking recreationally for years and had developed a consistent orientation toward wildlife. She believed that animals were misrepresented as dangerous, that close encounters were more often peaceful than violent, and that the people producing warnings were operating from excessive caution. I understand where a belief like that comes from. Years of hiking without incident will do that. The problem is that absence of a bad outcome is not the same thing as presence of a safe situation. It just reads that way when nothing has gone wrong yet. The group spotted a black bear feeding near the clearing approximately 80 yards ahead, a textbook safe wildlife sighting. Observe from where you are. Do not approach, do not introduce food, allow the animal to move away on its own terms. Linda reached into her backpack and removed food. Every time I read this case, it really baffles me how this situation unfolded. There was a bear just 80 yards away. She took her bag and she took her food out so she could feed the bear. She walked towards it, offering the said food. Other hikers who were seeing this unfold told her to stop, warning her. More than one person was telling her, but she did it anyway. Black bears operate on a graduated response sequence when their space is compressed, particularly in the presence of food stimulus. That sequence moves through awareness, alert posture, pacing, and then bluff charges, short, fast movements that stop short of contact. These charges are the animal's structured final warning. When those charges produce retreat, the sequence ends. When they do not, the sequence does not continue in the same mode. The bear produced bluff charges as Linda closed the distance short, fast, covering 10 to 15 feet and stopping. The signal was not ambiguous. Linda slowed but did not stop. She closed further. The bear was doing everything it could to communicate. The people on the trail were doing everything they could to communicate. Nobody could reach her. At approximately 25 feet, the bear's behavior shifted out of the warning phase entirely. The pacing stopped. The posture dropped forward. The animal had run its graduated warning sequence to its end without the situation resolving. The bear covered the remaining distance and drove into Linda with its forepaws, bringing her to the ground immediately. From the ground, the bear applied biting force to her head and neck. A black bear's jaw generates over 700 pounds of bite force per square inch at the canine teeth, sufficient to produce fatal injury to the skull or cervical vertebrae without extended contact. The attack was sustained, the injuries severe and concentrated in the upper body and neck. Linda Mercer did not survive. Wildlife officials were direct. The approach, the food introduction, and the continuation past multiple clear warning behaviors had constructed the sequence that killed her. The hikers who tried to stop her were right. They read the situation correctly, communicated it clearly, and communicated it more than once. I think about those hikers. The ones who called it out, who watched it happen, who were right about everything and still couldn't change the outcome. That's a weight I imagine they carried home with them. The next person on this list didn't approach the bear with food. She approached it with the intent to command it and found out exactly what a grizzly on open trail reads when a human advances toward it, making noise. It was September 12, 2017, and Wyoming's high country was in the narrow window between late summer and mountain autumn. The aspens had begun turning, and the landscape above the tree line was clear in every direction, the kind of fall day in the Rockies that produces excellent visibility and a particular quality of false confidence that comes from being able to see everything and misunderstanding what seeing everything means. Patricia Doyle was 57 years old. She had hiked extensively and built a personal operating philosophy around the premise that fearlessness communicated clearly and physically produced better outcomes than retreat. That record had accumulated enough confirmations that it had become, in her outdoor approach, close to universal. The problem with a framework never tested against the right counter evidence is that it doesn't know where its own limits are, and sometimes the test that finds those limits is fatal. The group came around a bend and found a grizzly bear approximately 40 yards ahead, in the trail, partially turned toward the approaching figures. 40 yards in open terrain is a meaningful distance, enough space for a slow lateral retreat, enough time for the bear to assess the group as non-threatening. The other hikers began backing away slowly together. That was the correct read. That was the exit the situation was offering. Patricia stopped, turned toward the bear, raised her walking stick, and began advancing while vocalizing. Shouting at the animal, waving the stick, moving toward it with the intent to drive it off the trail. Noise-making and large body positioning have utility in certain bear encounters. An already alert grizzly, at 40 yards on an open trail, receiving an approaching and vocalizing human, is not one of those contexts. What Patricia communicated to that bear was not dominance, it escalated. And a grizzly receiving escalation at 40 yards does not pause to reconsider. The grizzly charged. A grizzly covering 30 to 35 yards at full speed does so in approximately 2.5 to 3 seconds. Patricia had no mechanism available that would have produced a different physical result once the charge began. The rest of the group, who had retreated, were far enough back that the bear's attention did not extend to them. Patricia had, in a very literal sense, selected herself out of the group by being the one moving toward the animal while everyone else moved away. The bear struck her at full running speed. 400 to 600 pounds at 30 miles per hour delivered through the forepaws drove her to the ground. Biting force was applied to the back of the neck and upper spine while the forepaws raked across the scalp and shoulders. The attack was over in seconds. Patricia Doyle died on a trail that the rest of her group walked away from because the rest of her group made a different decision at the moment that mattered. Reminder for you or anyone watching, never ever try to get the attention of a wild animal, especially if that animal can easily end your life in the blink of an eye. That failure was internal and invisible until the bear charged. The next person had no internal miscalibration to overcome. She had direct, first-hand warnings delivered by multiple people who had personally seen the animal. She decided those people were wrong. It was June 3rd, 2015, and the forests of British Columbia's interior were deep into the long northern days of early summer. The mixed-use path Sharon Bennett had been hiking ran through dense, second-growth timber undergrowth heavy enough that the visual field closed off after a few yards, the path bending frequently so that what lay around any corner was not visible until you had already arrived at it. Sharon Bennett was 51 years old. She worked in sales and held a specific and documented relationship with unsolicited advice from people she didn't know, which people who knew her described uniformly as dismissive. In most domains, this produced minor frictions. I find myself thinking about the gap between a pattern that generates minor frictions in daily life and that same pattern activated on a wilderness trail. It's the same behavior. The consequences just scale completely differently depending on what the advice is about. Sharon was approximately a mile and a half in when two cyclists came from the opposite direction, slowing to communicate with every person they passed. A black bear had been spotted on the trail ahead within the previous 20 minutes. They had observed the animal directly, reversed direction because of it, and were relaying specific first-hand information to everyone moving toward it. These weren't people being cautious. These were people who had seen the bear, turned around because of it, and were now telling everyone exactly what they had seen. Several hikers in Sharon's immediate vicinity reversed direction, Sharon continued. Her assessment was that the warning was overstated, that the cyclists had read the situation as more dangerous than it was. The certainty it takes to hear a first-hand account from someone who just saw the animal and reversed course, and to decide you know better than them about what they experienced. That's a very specific kind of confidence, and it was wrong in a very specific and irreversible way. Sharon reached the flagged section of trail. The bear was near the vegetation at the trail's edge, partially inside the brush line, visible from the path at roughly 15 feet. Sharon stopped and held her position. Holding position at 15 feet from a black bear in dense vegetation is not a neutral act. The bear is registering the continued presence through scent and sound, and a stationary human at that range who is not retreating is processed as a presence that is not resolving. The bear began displaying clear agitation, weight shifting, vocalizing, orienting directly toward Sharon's position. Sharon remained in position. The bear lunged from the brush edge. The distance between the tree line and the trail was not enough for the charge to develop into a sustained run. The bear covered the gap in a single explosive movement, already committed before Sharon could process the transition from warning behavior to contact. The bear struck her with its forepaws, driving her backward and off her feet. From the ground, the attack continued, the bear applying its jaw to her upper body and arms, raking with the forepaws across her back and shoulders. The injuries were severe and concentrated in the upper body and neck. Sharon Bennett died from injuries sustained in the attack. The cyclists who warned her were right. The hikers who turned around were right. All of that correct information was available to Sharon before she reached the animal, and none of it reached her in a form she was willing to receive. From a trail where first-hand warnings arrived from multiple sources and were set aside, we go to a wilderness viewing excursion in Alaska where the warnings came not from strangers on a path, but from the professionals she had specifically hired and traveled a considerable distance to follow. It was August 22nd, 2018, and the Alaskan backcountry was in the compressed peak of a northern summer. The days long, the tundra meadows open and wide. The group had been transported to the observation area by a guiding operation whose staff had worked this specific terrain across multiple seasons. They knew the meadow's layout, the wind behavior along the ridge, and the behavioral patterns of the grizzlies that used this area during the late summer feeding period. The 150-yard viewing boundary they had established was not a default setting. It was the product of direct operational experience with the specific animal they were observing. Carol Hastings was 55 years old. She documented travel and had built her professional output around the premise that compelling content required pushing past the comfortable margin, moving beyond where the person next to you stopped. On this tundra meadow, that framework was being applied to a grizzly bear that the guides knew personally, had observed repeatedly at various distances, and had identified the exact point where its tolerance ended. That information existed nowhere except in the experience of the guides. Carol had access to it only through their instructions. She discarded those instructions almost immediately. The bear entered the meadow during the early morning feeding window, visible from the group's position at just under 150 yards. The guides communicated the viewing boundary before the animal appeared and reiterated it when the bear came into view. Carol began moving past the boundary. One of the guides moved quickly in her direction and told her to return. She continued past him too. At approximately 80 yards, the bear raised its head and oriented toward Carol's position. At 60 yards, it rose onto its hind legs. At 50 yards, it dropped back to all fours and charged. A grizzly covering 50 yards of open tundra at full speed reaches that distance in under 4 seconds. Carol had registered the bear's posture shift and was moving away, but a human moving on foot across open tundra does not change what 4 seconds means at that closing rate. The guides were too far to physically intercept what was happening. The bear struck Carol in the open meadow. Several hundred pounds of mass at running speed drove her to the ground immediately. Biting force was applied to the head and upper neck. The forepaws raked across the back of the scalp and shoulders. The open ground gave the bear no environmental reason to disengage quickly, and the attack ran until the physical signals it was responding to had been eliminated. Carol Hastings died in a section of meadow she had been specifically, directly, and repeatedly instructed not to enter by the people she had paid a guiding fee specifically to be directed by. That's the part I can't get past. Not the charge, not the contact, but the fact that she had purchased the expertise that would have kept her alive, and then immediately discarded it the moment it became inconvenient. We moved to an Idaho hillside in early spring where the danger wasn't visible, the line wasn't marked, and the most lethal piece of information in the situation hadn't revealed itself yet. It was April 28th, 2013, and the foothills of central Idaho were in the early and genuinely deceptive phase of spring. The snow pulled back from the lower elevations, the brush sparse and stripped. The hillside had a quality that mid-spring landscapes in the Mountain West frequently produce, an openness that makes the environment feel more readable than it actually is. The absence of dense cover makes it feel like what is visible is what is present. It was not. Diane Holloway was 52 years old. She worked in school administration and had spent much of her adult life acting on a specific and consistent instinct. When she observed an animal that appeared to be in distress or difficulty, she moved toward it. In the context where that instinct had fired over the years, it had produced benign outcomes repeatedly. I want to be careful here, because this case is genuinely different from the others. Diane wasn't dismissive or overconfident. She saw what looked like vulnerable animals and moved toward them from something that looked from the outside a lot like care. The instinct itself isn't the problem. The problem is that it fired before the full picture had assembled itself. She came over a rise and spotted 2 grizzly bear cubs below her on the hillside, near a cluster of boulders in a brushy depression. The cubs were small, born in January, roughly 4 months old, recently emerged from the den. They were moving without visible distress. They were also not alone. Diane did not know this yet because the brush screened what was behind them. The hikers immediately behind Diane began backing away the moment they saw the cubs. The absence of a visible adult bear is a limitation of the viewer's sightline, not evidence that one is not present. A grizzly sow in spring has emerged from the den with cubs that are small and entirely dependent on her. Her awareness of the immediate environment is organized around one priority, and it does not tolerate ambiguity. Diane moved toward the cubs. The hikers behind her communicated their concern as clearly as anyone can to someone they cannot physically restrain. Diane continued. This one is harder to reconstruct emotionally than the others because there's no dismissiveness here, no arrogance. There's just a person who wanted to help, who couldn't see the thing that made helping impossible, who had been told to stop by people who could see more of the situation than she could, and who kept going anyway. Hikers that backed away started shouting at Diane to get away as well, but she did not listen. A grizzly sow defending cubs in spring does not issue a warning display before escalating. She monitors from concealment and initiates contact when the distance to her cubs has reached the threshold her biology defines as critical. The mother bear was in the brush behind the boulders, tracking Diane's approach from a position Diane had no information about. When Diane had closed to within a few yards of the cubs, the sow emerged. The distance between the sow's concealed position and Diane's location was less than 20 feet when she came out. There was brush, and then there was a 350-pound bear already in full motion, already inside the distance where any response available to Diane was irrelevant. The sow struck Diane with both forepaws at full speed, driving her off her feet and into the hillside slope. Biting force was applied to the back of Diane's head and neck. The claws raked the scalp and upper back, and what the bear produced in those seconds was catastrophic. Wildlife officers determined that the mother's response was a direct defensive reaction to Diane's proximity to the cubs. The most important fact in the situation, the one that would have reversed the decision entirely, was the one the brush had hidden. From a hillside where the most dangerous element was the one not yet visible, we moved to a trail that had been closed, not because something might happen, but because something was already happening, and every access point had been clearly marked to say so. It was October 5th, 2018, and the backcountry of northwestern Wyoming was in the first serious days of fall. The trail system at altitude had taken on the quiet of a season that had cleared out most of its foot traffic. It was not empty. It was a bear, a carcass, and a zone of territory the bear had claimed and was defending at a biological intensity that wildlife managers place in a specific and well-documented category. Personnel from a local wildlife management office had located a grizzly bear, actively guarding a large elk carcass approximately a quarter mile from a primary trail junction. The bear had been at the carcass for more than 2 days. Closure signs had been placed at every access point. Staff had been physically deployed to the main trailheads with instructions to turn visitors back. The boundary had been positioned with buffer distance built in, ensuring that a hiker who stopped at the signs was well outside the zone where the bear's behavior would shift from tolerance to aggression. Signs, staff, buffer distance, specific information, all of it in place before anyone arrived. Brenda Collins was 58 years old. She had organized this trip in advance, and the closure she encountered at the trailhead did not reach her as information about confirmed, specific, proximate danger. It reached her as interference with a plan she had already finalized. She bypassed the closure and entered the restricted area. I've thought about framing the closure a lot as interference rather than information. It's a cognitive move a lot of us are capable of making when we've committed hard enough to a plan. The plan feels real. The sign feels like an obstacle. The bear at that moment doesn't feel real at all. A grizzly bear in possession of a large carcass in the weeks preceding denning is in the most food-protective behavioral state the species produces. Caloric requirements reach approximately 20,000 calories per day, and behavior is comprehensively reorganized around the acquisition and protection of food. The response does not begin with a warning phase. The bear is already in maximum resource protection mode when the intruder arrives, and the outcome resolves in a single direction, with the consistency wildlife professionals treat as a defining characteristic of this encounter type. The closure perimeter mapped directly onto the zone where this behavior was active. The signs did not describe a general risk in a general area. They described a specific bear, a specific carcass, a specific location, and the specific consequence of entering the space between them. Brenda covered several miles into the restricted zone. The trail moved through a natural drainage corridor that funneled toward the carcass site, and the terrain features flanking it compressed the range at which the bear would detect her approach. A hyperphagia phase grizzly defending a carcass does not issue a visible warning before engaging. The bear is present, and then the bear is moving, and the distance between those two states is a fraction of a second. The bear charged at full speed. The contact was explosive, the full forward momentum of a 400+ pound animal delivered through the forepaws, driving Brenda to the ground immediately. Biting was applied to the head, neck, and upper torso. The forepaws raked repeatedly across the back and shoulders. Brenda was alone. There was no mechanism available to interrupt the sequence, and the attack ran to the point where the bear registered that the threat had been neutralized and returned to the carcass. When Brenda failed to return, a search was organized. The investigation required no complex reconstruction. The closure signs were where they had been placed. The trailhead staffing logs were complete. The trail into the restricted zone showed a single set of boot prints moving inward. That detail one set of prints moving toward the thing every system in place had been designed to keep her away from is the image from this entire series that stays with me longest. Trail closures and active wildlife management are not the product of excessive caution. They are posted when someone with training and situational authority has walked into the terrain, located the specific animal, assessed the behavioral conditions, and drawn a boundary at the exact point where the biology makes the outcome non-negotiable. The closure Brenda walked past was not a map of where a bear might be. It was a map of where one was, what it was doing, and what would happen if someone entered the space between the warning and the carcass. All of that information was at the trailhead, in writing, at every access point, reinforced by physical staff. The information did not fail. Brenda Collins walked past it and into the outcome it had been placed there to prevent.